Netflix's flagship drama The Crown is back for season 3 with a new cast to explore more of the royal family's life over the 1960s and 70s. I'm Rob LaCuria, senior editor here at Gold Derby, with Josh O'Connor, who plays Prince Charles' really uncanny portrayal and, to me, one of the highlights of the season. Josh, when you landed the role of Prince Charles, what was the first thought that went through your head?
I think initially I was sort of terrified because I'd seen series 1 and 2, and I was a huge fan of the show, and Vanessa Kirby, who played Princess Margaret in the first couple of series, is a very good friend of mine. And so there was a kind of, I guess, a sort of fear of trying to kind of take on that brilliantly successful show. But then just excitement. I mean, it didn't last too long. It was sort of such a golden opportunity to play that part. And and I just couldn't wait to get started.
You know, what occurs to me when I'm speaking to actors who are playing real people, particularly really famous people like Prince Charles, is the fine line between impersonation or caricature and portraying a living, breathing person. So how difficult is that to play a living person authentically, but also making him or making the character your own?
I think that there's a balance to be struck between trying to do a kind of a mimic version of a real person. And it's particularly dangerous with the royal family, I think, because they're so part of our consciousness. Even if you're not a royalist, like I'm not really a royalist, and yet you kind of you do understand, you do kind of recognize traits and isms that they have. So for me, it was trying to find a balance of making an audience feel safe in the knowledge that what I was doing felt like Prince Charles, or felt like a Prince Charles that they could recognize, but at the same time being true to Peter's work and the story of The Crown, which is ultimately a work of fiction and drama. And so, to answer your question, basically what I kind of immediately thought of was one of my favorite films and portrayals of real people or a real person was a film about Bob Dylan called I'm Still Here or I'm Not There. Yeah. And in that you've got 8 or 9 actors playing aspects of Dylan's personality. And I remember seeing that and thinking that's far more interesting is seeing Heath Ledger play the kind of rock star, film star version of Dylan, having Ben Whishaw play the poet version, Kate Blanchett play the kind of Dylan in the public eye. I think that to me is more interesting. And so that kind of gave me the freedom to say, right, well, I'll do the kind of the arch back and speaking through my mouth and working on the dialect, but actually gave me the freedom to kind of release all that and just play a character and invent and be creative.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you put it that way, because I would have thought there would have been some pressure to get it right still, and you would never want to hear feedback about how your performance is merely just a caricature and nothing deeper than that, and it certainly is not that at all. But I wonder, given how important the royal family is to so many people, did you feel any kind of pressure in taking on the role? There is a pressure, but I felt a pressure for a little while, but actually not massively, because as I say, I think ultimately, as soon as you kind of acknowledge that this is fiction, what Peter does so beautifully is he takes real public occasions and they kind of punctuate the various episodes and the overall narrative of the show. That's what's so groundbreaking about the show is the kind of use of fiction and fact. And so whilst you have these kind of very public moments, and that's often helpful for an actor to kind of, if you are portraying a real person, to go, well, with the investiture, the way I interact with Olivia in a public space, or with the Queen in a public space, had to be, I felt, true to what exists, which is that there is footage of how that played out. And then the treat and the real kind of excitement, and therefore where the pressure, the kind of lightens, I suppose, is after that, when you have scenes behind the closed doors and where it becomes fiction. And I think, and so all that kind of pressure kind of subsided, I think, when we started getting into the more meaty dialogue scenes.
What surprised me the most after watching the season is that I had preconceived ideas about Charles, like probably most people do, and some of them were dispelled in a way in which, like in your take on him, and obviously Peter's take on him and the other characters as a young man, he's actually weirdly relatable. That's what I found by the end of the season, isn't he?
Yeah. He is. I think at the heart of this story, there's an episode, I think episode 8 or 9 is called Dangling Man. And that's the title of the episode. And that comes from a speech that Charles has with Camilla, where he relates his position as being the heir to the throne to being like a character in a Saul Bellow novel, The Dangling Man. And in that novel, there's a man who's waiting to be drafted to go to war, and he actually wants to be drafted because it will give his life meaning, even though it means going to certain death or whatever it is. So that, to me, of course, from a basic point of view, the sympathy is there. The idea that a young man is waiting for his mother to die for his life to take meaning. That I have sympathy for that, and so initially there's that kind of as a sort of canvas to work off. That's a really nice starting point. And then I think, it was all about how do we can we make people feel sorry for Charles, first of all, and then I think going forward, obviously we're in the midst of shooting series 4 at the moment, and I know where I'm going with Charles, and I know where Peter's going with Charles, and so there was also a kind of a foresight and wanting to show where we end up and how that kind of starts. So it was very much a conscious decision to make him sympathetic.
Yeah, he's a pretty sensitive, contemplative young guy, particularly in the scenes with Camilla Shand. Was that angle particularly interesting to you as a way for you to kind of get into his headspace? Was that your way in, so to speak?
I think so. In terms of thoughtfulness, because I think he is historically, Prince Charles as a person has been thoughtful. In some ways, he's been a radical. In the 70s and 80s, when he was talking about climate change and people sort of laughed him off, he was a sort of buffoon character because everyone thought, who's this mad prince talking about climate or like the destruction of our earth? And of course, now we see that that's backed up and it's more accepted that is the case. And so I think he is a kind of a thinker and a thoughtful person. And added on, again, another treat about the show is that we've got the power of hindsight and know that we're where we are now, which is that he's still waiting. And I think the idea of him waiting all that long must mean that he has had time to think and be thoughtful and pensive and sensitive. And so, that was very much, again, kind of clear in my mind that was what we were going to do.
It's such a great scene in episode 9. I'm glad you raised it because I had it in my notes about how he's talking about the Dangling Man with Camilla existing in a seemingly timeless abyss, other words that he used in the script. Waiting for that moment, but then he makes it a big prank and laughs about it with Camilla, obviously, because then it reminds you that he's still a young guy and he's still trying to impress a woman on a date. But I still thought there was so much truth to that, and I think that was probably one of the key scenes for the whole season for your character. So would you agree that episode 9 is probably one of the highlights for you in terms of development of the character?
Yeah, that for me, episode 6, Charles' entrance for me was the kind of a standout episode, partly because I think it's the ideas that Peter's written in that episode are epic, and it feels so Shakespearean. It ends with a Shakespeare soliloquy. But the episode itself feels so, it's almost like a scene from Gladiator, you know, when he's going up for the investiture. So that always was a kind of standout episode for me. But if I was to go by scenes, the Dangling Man scene, which ends up in a kind of prank, was 100% the scene. I think it's the first scene I read from the scripts. And it just felt like, as you say, it was kind of, it's so beautifully articulated. And as you say, the prank thing is that's a really British thing that we do, which is that if we let our guard down a little bit and become a little bit too emotional, or we give a bit too much of ourselves away, we undercut it with a joke. And it happened, and Peter does it time and time again. It's so effective. So that is a perfect example where he talks about, really truthful thoughts about waiting for his mother to die for his life to take meaning, being in this timeless, as you say, timeless void, or whatever he says. But another great moment of that is in episode 6, when at the beginning of episode 6, when Princess Anne comes over, and they're talking about how Prince Charles is perfectly happy at Cambridge, doesn't want to be taken out of Cambridge to go and learn Welsh. And Princess Anne kisses him on the cheek, which you never see that sort of affection, and then immediately undercuts it with a punch to the stomach. And I think that is essentially as a kind of an example of exactly what I'm talking about, really, that Peter does it time and time again. It is a very British thing, but I think it works so well.
Yeah, I think it's probably also an Australian thing, to be honest. But I know what you mean, 100%. And what I love as well, you speak about the investiture. That's episode 6, and you obviously had to learn a lot of Welsh, and we come to realise who this guy is and where he's from and what he's doing. By episode 9, you've been on quite a journey, and for me, the absolute highlight is after Edward's funeral, when you turn around and you look at the 6 or 9 people from the family. They're kind of like predators staring at you, and Charles realises that Edward's been replaced as an outsider, so to speak, by Charles now. What were your thoughts on that aspect, that Charles is more like an outsider, especially given that the family did tear them apart, or tear Camilla and Charles apart in the early days?
Yeah, it's another. I really love that moment in the series. I think that another kind of really brilliant thing about the show, which that moment describes so well, is if you follow the show from series 1, there are things that happen time and time again, lessons that haven't been learned by the family. So, Margaret's story, essentially, of not being allowed to be with the one she loves, and the ramifications of that, and the effects that's had, the ripple effects going on in time. We are starting to see that, and that is exactly what happens with Charles. And Charles talks about it in that episode to his mother and says, we of all people should know what happens when you stop someone from being with the person they love. But I think, and Edward's before that, Edward having to abdicate to choose love over duty, I suppose. So I really I loved those scenes. I loved working with Derek Jacobi, who, we did so much work together on this feeling of an outsider, and also of beyond that, of feeling like a sensitive king, that we often talk about in the royal family as like any leader, actually, beyond royal family and kind of political leaders, about being strong. And historically kings of England have been, war kings and beacons of strength. And actually the weak kings historically, and from a drama point of view, have been Richard II is one example in Shakespeare, which is the soliloquy that Charles does at the end of episode 6, is Richard II, who was someone who was a sensitive king. And I think David was that, and I think Charles is that. So I think turning around and looking back on the family all in black is so gloomy. I always thought it was kind of like a scene from The Sopranos or something. It's kind of this weirdly kind of mafioso response.
I had the exact same reaction. I was like, this feels like a Martin Scorsese kind of Godfather-y type film, and it just works so perfectly. It just solidified in my mind where Charles was probably going in season 4, perhaps, and what we know of him too. Given that we're both effectively royal subjects, why are we and others so fascinated by this family? Like, fundamentally, what do you think it is about them that we are also obsessed with, even if we're not royalists like you and I are not?
I think that there's it's a strange. I think a lot of across the world we are fascinated by tradition, and we're fascinated by anything that feels historical, I guess. I mean, it does feel historical. To me, it feels very historical, and I think the idea of a family who are born into duty, born into power, is a strange concept when we live in a Western society that's had, strong democratic process for many years, many generations. So that kind of that always feels strange. I think maybe people are interested in that. I think also that I guess the interest as such, it goes back to they're essentially the kind of the first lot of fame. I mean, that's where fame comes from, right? We're about to, in series 4, we're touching on the sort of Diana years, and Diana was the epitome of that. We've replaced those kind of royal figures, which would have been in the past as our kind of ultimate icons. We've replaced with pop stars and movie stars and models and what have you, and celebrities. So I guess it's, at its heart, it's like an obsession with celebrity and wealth and power. But actually, now we're coming to a time where it's like, I think it's slightly changed, where politically we are in a shaky, I would say we're in a shaky time, and I think that the royal family represent continuity. My grandmother is a royalist and she loves the royal family, and I think for her they represent her history, her memories, nostalgia. So I think that's where it comes from. And I think for me, I'm a Republican, so obviously not. But as people, especially having played this role and being part of this show, I have huge sympathy for them as people. I just don't know about it as a structure.
That's right. I mean, I really admire them, and in fact, I've really loved watching their story on this show. Even though the show is, essentially fictional, it's still based on some fact. And as you and I both probably identify as Republicans, we still can appreciate, everything they've done and everything they stand for, which is so fascinating. So just moving on to other things, you've done plenty of other kinds of work, like Les Miserables and Peaky Blinders and The Durrells and God's Own Country. Are you able to say what your favourite genre is so far in terms of your work? Like, do you like the period pieces? Do you like the dramas? Do you like doing comedy? What have you found to be the most challenging and most exciting so far?
For me, it's always been character-led. I think there seems to have developed a theme about masculinity and what that means. God's Own Country was a film about a farmer who falls in love with a Romanian migrant worker, and what that means, allowing himself to be loved and be in love. And so that was very much a film about masculinity in my eyes. I think Only You, a film earlier this year, but kind of dealing with similar kind of aspects. So I think that's kind of inevitably happened, and not through any choice of my own. I think ultimately it's about playing roles that feel very different to myself and feel transformative and kind of challenge me that way. That's not always, that can't always happen like that, I don't think. But that's certainly what's driven me so far.
Well, Josh, thanks for your time today. You've got plenty of awards on the horizon for The Crown. You've already won plenty of awards, so we look forward to seeing more of you on the screens. Thanks again.
Thank you. Nice to meet you. Thanks.
Everyone go to goldderby.com right now, make your predictions for The Crown, nominated at the Screen Actors Guild Awards for Best Ensemble, and watch all of our videos, press subscribe so that you can watch all of our chats with contenders just like Josh.